So, this is going to sound strange, but when I was growing up, my backyard was a cemetery. Maybe not the whole backyard, but right behind our fence, it was there. And let me tell you, some creepy things happened there. The scariest in particular is the story that I'm telling you now. I was 14 at the time. I was an only child and did a lot of stuff by myself growing up. Well, one day, I'd gotten home from school early and my parents were still away at work. I had no homework to do. I was bored of my game systems, and I decided that I would go out and take a stroll through the cemetery. It was an old one, like there were gravestones from the mid-1800s in there. It was a hot day, and I was just walking around and looking at all the names and dates on the stones. I was looking at this one stone in particular when this old lady approached me. I didn't see where she came from, and I didn't even hear her. She kind of just appeared. She stood next to me and asked what I was doing. I told her just checking out the graves. She told me the grave that I was looking at in particular was her youngest sister, Rose. She went into detail about how her sister had died at the age of 5 from cancer, but was a lovely girl. They named her Rose because it was her favorite flower, and she had always been seen carrying them and giving them to people. It was actually very sweet the way the lady explained it to me. I ended up saying goodbye to her and wished her a good rest of her day. Later that same night, I was upstairs in my room playing Star Wars Battlefront on my computer. I was trying to beat this certain level when I heard this tapping on my window. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe just the wind, and went back to my game. But then I heard it again, but this time louder. I got off my computer and walked over to it. I opened the window to see what was making the noise. When I opened it, sitting on the ledge was a single red rose. Mind you, my bedroom was on the second floor. There were no trees or anything you could use to climb up and tap my window, let alone place something on the ledge. I took the rose into my room and then remembered the conversation with the old lady about her sister Rose, who always used to give roses to people. My bedroom faces the cemetery. I couldn't see anyone out there. It was completely dark and empty. To this day, I'm truly convinced that it was that woman's sister who visited me at my window that night and left the rose. We've since moved out of that house now and I have my own place. But every now and then, I'll go back to that cemetery and revisit Rose's grave. Since then, I'm fully convinced that our world is not the only world. There is something beyond what we can see in the physical realm. Thanks for listening. Back when I was a teenager, me and all my friends used to love to sneak out of our houses for the thrill of it. Well, one day, my friend Jimmy and Frankie had the grand idea that we should sneak out and check out the local cemetery at night, and I was all for it. We snuck out a little after midnight. We always had to be sure that all of our parents were fast asleep. The cemetery wasn't far from our houses. It was about a half-hour walk to get there. I remember that it was a dark night, but there were no clouds covering the moon. We could see pretty well despite it being past midnight. We entered through the cemetery gates and started to explore immediately. We kept joking around that we would most likely see some kind of ghost or a spirit. We started making our way to the back of the cemetery that was bordering the deep forest. We were reading the names of the gravestones when we heard this noise. We all got quiet and listened. It wasn't the wind blowing or anything like that, but it sounded like someone panting hard. We surveyed the back of the cemetery and then saw it. There was someone standing over one of the graves, a shovel in their hand, and they were digging. We thought maybe it was a caretaker or a worker, but quickly realized that they wouldn't be out here this late in the dark. We got a bit closer, staying low behind the long rows of graves, and watched as the man threw something into the hole that was wrapped in what looked like black trash bags. Whatever it was that he threw in looked big, almost like the size of an adult man. Then, once it was in the hole, he started throwing the dirt back on top of it. Me and my buddy started to realize that this guy was trying to bury something that wasn't meant to be seen. In fact, I didn't want to say it to my friends because I was too frightened to, but at the time, I was almost certain that it was a body. We started to get nervous that this guy would see us, and we were making our way back out the cemetery when Frankie stepped on this large branch by accident. The crack of it echoed into the night. We looked up, and the man who was digging the hole was looking directly at us. From the moonlight, I could see the anger and hate on the man's face. He threw the shovel aside and started sprinting right for us. At this point, we all started booking it out of the cemetery. I ran so fast that I thought my heart was going to explode. Luckily, we knew which houses to cut in between, and we eventually lost the guy. When I finally made it back to my house, I felt like I had no choice but to wake up my parents and tell them what we saw. Literally that same night, the police were called out to the cemetery to investigate. They didn't find the man, but they did find the hole that he was digging. And inside that hole, they found a dead man. Whoever was burying him laid the corpse on top of an already existing coffin and then tried to bury him. I guess he thought that no one would consider to look for a dead man inside of a cemetery. As far as I know, that guy was never caught. I believe I did see on the news that the death was gang-related, which also terrifies me because me and my friends were witnesses to them trying to dispose of it. And from what I've seen in documentaries, witnesses to criminals don't end up too well. But thankfully, me and all my friends are okay. No one has tried to contact us or harm us because of what we saw, and the police left our names out of the investigation. We're all still friends, and we still talk about that night in the cemetery. So back in 2020, I was obsessed with cemeteries. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the quarantine, but that year, I started to learn and study everything about them that I could. It got to a point where the research that I was doing online wasn't cutting it, and I needed to go out physically and explore them. And before you call me weird or whatever, I get it. Believe me, my friends and family all thought the same thing. Anyway, it was the weekend. I live in a small town outside of a major city, and I decided that this was the day that I would go and check one out. I googled the closest one to me, and it was only like a half-hour drive away. When I got there, it was empty. Minus all the graves, there was no one else in there but me. I found it oddly calming and surreal. I was walking up and down the rows, trying to imagine what the lives of those under me would have been like, when I started to feel watched. I turned around, and again, nothing. I couldn't see anybody in the cemetery. I kept on walking, and that's when I saw him. The cemetery had a bunch of trees that sort of blocked your view. Well, this guy came out from behind one of them, walking his small dog. I noticed that he had flowers in his hands, and he was placing them at one of the stones. I didn't look for too long because I wanted to be respectful, especially if it was a loved one that he was visiting. I stayed for maybe another hour when I noticed that man and his dog were now gone. I was alone again. I decided that I would go over to the grave that he had put flowers on, just to see who the name was. Now, I will warn you, this part is disturbing and may trigger some people. I got to the gravestone and saw that dog the man was walking was being hung from his leash that was tied to the gravestone. I literally screamed at the sight of it. I quickly untied the dog off the stone, but it was already too late. The dog was dead. I ran up and down the entire cemetery trying to find that man, but I couldn't. I ended up calling the police and showing them the dead dog that was hung. And here's the even weirder part. The officer that came out said that this was the third hung dog that's been reported in this cemetery over the past 2 months. I was absolutely baffled when he told me this. The officer told me they had been tailing certain suspects, but they haven't caught anyone for the crimes yet. I still live in that area, and as far as I know, no one has been caught for it yet. I checked the news and the social media, but there hasn't been any more dog hangings, so maybe they stopped for fear of getting caught. But fuck man, seeing that dog hanging really messed me up. I still occasionally go to the cemetery and walk around, and thankfully, nothing like that has happened since.